For centuries, the image has been clear. Endless lines of chained slaves bent beneath the sun, whipped into dragging stone blocks across the desert. The pyramids rising not from organization, but from suffering. It is a powerful picture. It explains the scale. It explains the brutality we expect from ancient power. It is also almost certainly wrong. Welcome to the history of the world, where we explain how power rises, how systems endure, and how empires fall. The pyramids of Giza were constructed around 2600 to 2500 BCE during Egypt's fourth dynasty. The pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure ordered monuments that would dominate the horizon for millennia. The Great Pyramid of Khufu alone contains roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing several tons. Its precision still unsettles modern observers. When confronted with something so vast, we look for a simple explanation. Slavery provides one. It requires no coordination beyond cruelty. It assumes ancient rulers relied solely on fear. It aligns with later histories of forced labor across empires. It feels familiar, but familiarity is not evidence. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves can be traced partly to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were completed. Herodotus described a massive labor force compelled by pharaohs, though even his accounts mix hearsay and exaggeration. He was reporting what Egyptians of his time believed or told him, not what scribes of Khufu recorded. Later interpretations layered additional assumptions. Biblical narratives of Hebrew bondage in Egypt became loosely associated in popular imagination with pyramid construction, though there is no historical or archaeological evidence linking those events. In the 19th century, European colonial observers, accustomed to seeing forced labor underpin imperial projects, projected their own models of power backward onto ancient societies. And then came cinema. A neat explanation endured because it required no further investigation. Monument plus ancient ruler equals slaves. It is clean. It is morally satisfying. It reassures us that such structures could not have been built through cooperation. At the time, this seemed reasonable. It wasn't. To understand what really happened, we must step back into Old Kingdom Egypt and examine the system that existed before the first block was placed. By the time Khufu began building his pyramid around 2580 BCE, Egypt had already been politically unified for centuries. Central authority was not experimental. It was entrenched. The Nile River, flooding predictably each year, deposited fertile silt along its banks. Agricultural surplus was not an occasional blessing. It was a structural feature of the environment. This mattered more than brute strength. Each year, during the inundation season, farmland was submerged. Farmers could not work their fields. For several months, labor capacity existed that could not be applied to agriculture. A centralized state capable of redistributing grain, tracking populations, and organizing projects could mobilize that labor without permanently displacing communities. In other words, Egypt possessed both surplus and downtime. Power in the Old Kingdom was not only military, it was administrative. Scribes recorded harvests, officials assessed taxes, storehouses managed grain redistribution, regional governors reported to the center. The ideological framework of Mahat, cosmic order and balance, framed obedience as participation in universal stability rather than submission to arbitrary will. Before we ever discuss the pyramids, we must acknowledge that Egypt was already a functioning bureaucratic state. This changes the question. The issue is no longer how did slaves build such monuments. It becomes how did a centralized system mobilize tens of thousands of people seasonally without collapsing? The answer began emerging in the late 20th century, not from speculation but from excavation. In the 1990s, archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team uncovered the remains of a workers' settlement near the Giza plateau. What they found did not resemble a slave encampment. It resembled an organized labor town. Barrack-style housing accommodated rotating crews. Large bakeries and breweries operated at scale, producing bread and beer in industrial quantities. Cattle bones indicated a diet that included substantial meat, far more than subsistence rations. Medical evidence suggests workers received treatment for injuries, including healed fractures. Slaves are not typically provisioned with organized medical care and regular beef. Nearby, tombs of workers were discovered, simple but respectful burials. Some bore inscriptions identifying the deceased as members of named crews, such as Friends of Khufu. In Egyptian belief, burial near a pharaoh was an honor. It implied participation in something sacred. Chains do not usually produce honorific titles. The evidence suggests a rotating labor force drawn from across Egypt, likely organized through a corvée system, a form of mandatory public service common in pre-modern states. Farmers contributed labor during flood season. Crews were structured, named, and supervised. Logistics were coordinated through scribal oversight. Assumption: only slaves would endure such work. Decision: mobilize citizens seasonally within an existing administrative framework. Consequence: large-scale construction without permanent displacement. Unintended result: a monument that appears inexplicable centuries later. The scale remains astonishing. Estimates suggest a peak workforce of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 laborers, far fewer than the 100,000 sometimes imagined in earlier accounts. Blocks were quarried locally when possible. Finer limestone casing stones were transported from Tura across the Nile. Granite beams for interior chambers were shipped from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers south. This required coordination, not chaos. Meanwhile, the system adjusted. Scribes tracked deliveries. Officials supervised teams. Inscriptions found in quarry sites record crew names and progress. The language is administrative, not punitive. The true wonder of the pyramids may not be the stone itself, but the organizational capacity behind it. None of this denies hardship. Construction was physically demanding. Accidents occurred. Labor was obligatory, not voluntary in a modern sense. Egypt was not a society of equal citizens debating public works. It was a hierarchical state enforcing duty within a religious framework. But obligation is not identical to chattel slavery, and that distinction matters. Slavery did exist in ancient Egypt, particularly in later periods. War captives were enslaved, household servants could be owned, forced labor existed in various forms. But there is no direct archaeological evidence that a vast enslaved population built the Fourth Dynasty pyramids. What we see instead is a state capable of mobilizing labor through taxation, redistribution, ideology, and timing. The pyramids were not only tombs, they were demonstrations. They demonstrated that the pharaoh could command resources from across the land. They demonstrated the administrative reach of the state. They demonstrated alignment between cosmic order and political order. Participation reinforced belief. Belief reinforced participation. It is tempting to prefer the slave narrative because it simplifies power. Cruelty feels straightforward. Organization feels more complex and perhaps more unsettling. Because if people built these monuments not through chains, but through structured obligation and shared belief, then power operated not only through fear, but through integration. To understand why tens of thousands of people would contribute labor to a project that did not directly benefit them in any immediate sense, we must look beyond stone and into belief. Old Kingdom Egypt was not merely a political structure, it was a cosmological one. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was considered the guarantor of Ma'at, the divine principle of balance, order, and harmony that held chaos at bay. The Nile flooded because order was maintained. Crops grew because order was preserved. Stability in heaven reflected stability on earth. This was not metaphor, it was governance. When Khufu commissioned his pyramid, he was not only securing a tomb, he was reinforcing cosmic continuity. The structure symbolized permanence. It was a physical statement that order would endure beyond a single lifetime. Participation in that construction was participation in preserving stability itself. At the time, this did not feel abstract. For farmers contributing labor during the flood season, the pyramid was not an alien imposition. It was a visible extension of the system that ensured their harvest. The same bureaucracy that organized construction also redistributed grain during lean periods. The state was extractive, but it was also redistributive. Participation reinforced inclusion. Assumption: People work only under coercion. Decision: align labor with belief and seasonal reality. Consequence: monumental output without constant rebellion. Unintended result: later observers misinterpret coordination as cruelty. Meanwhile, the system adjusted around scale. The logistics alone reveal depth of organization. Stone blocks quarried at Giza were transported along prepared causeways. Teams were divided into gangs and sub-crews, with graffiti in hidden chambers recording their names: the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. These inscriptions are informal, almost playful. They suggest identity and cohesion, not anonymous suffering. Food provisioning required agricultural forecasting. Cattle herds were maintained specifically for worker consumption. Bakeries operated continuously. Brewing facilities produced beer in industrial quantities, a staple of the Egyptian diet. The state was feeding thousands daily. This was not chaos driven by fear. It was supply chain management in the 3rd millennium BCE. None of this implies kindness. The labor was obligatory. The hierarchy was rigid. The pharaoh's authority was unquestioned. But it demonstrates something more powerful than terror: administrative capacity. Administrative capacity is what separates a ruler from a system. The pyramids were possible because Egypt had already developed taxation in kind, record-keeping, regional oversight, and ideological integration. These tools existed before the first foundation trench was dug. The monument was a product of the system, not the origin of it. This shifts the historical lens. If slavery had been the primary mechanism, the project would have required permanent subjugation of a massive captive population. That model creates instability. Enslaved populations resist. They require guards. They produce no long-term loyalty. The archaeological record does not show barracks surrounded by containment structures. It shows organized settlements integrated into broader economic flows. In fact, a permanent enslaved workforce of the size once imagined would likely have strained Egypt's resources far beyond what evidence suggests. Seasonal mobilization was more efficient. It minimized idle labor and maximized output during agricultural downtime. Efficiency, not cruelty, explains scale, but beneath this efficiency lay a deeper mechanism: identity formation. The Old Kingdom was a relatively young, unified state. Massive construction projects reinforced shared identity. Workers from different regions collaborated. Provincial communities saw tangible evidence of centralized coordination. The pyramids were not only tombs, they were national statements. Power sometimes binds through fear. It also binds through participation, and participation leaves traces. Worker burials near Giza contain modest grave goods, but also signs of care. Healed injuries indicate treatment rather than abandonment. Skeletal analysis suggests sustained nutrition. These individuals were not disposable property. They were part of a system that valued continuity over expendability. Ironically, this may be more revealing about power than the slave myth. The slave narrative frames ancient authority as chaotic brutality. The reality suggests something more structured: a state capable of organizing labor through taxation, belief, redistribution, and timing. What followed was not chaos, it was structure. This structure would endure for centuries beyond the Great Pyramids. Later, Old Kingdom rulers continued monumental construction, though at reduced scale. Eventually, central authority weakened during the First Intermediate Period, around 2200 BCE. Regional governors accumulated power. Monumental buildings slowed. The system strained not because slaves revolted, but because coordination thinned. When coordination fails, monuments shrink. This is the broader lesson. Large-scale projects are not proof of cruelty. They are proof of administrative reach. They indicate surplus, oversight, and integration. The pyramids required mathematical planning, labor scheduling, food distribution, ideological reinforcement, and interregional cooperation. In other words, they required a functioning state. Across history, similar patterns appear. Medieval cathedrals were not built by chained masses. They were constructed over generations by skilled labor within organized guild systems, funded by taxation and belief. Roman roads and aqueducts required military discipline, but also bureaucracy and engineering oversight. Even the Great Wall of China, often described solely through the lens of forced labor, depended on logistical networks that could sustain vast numbers. We prefer the slave story because it simplifies responsibility. It suggests that greatness requires cruelty alone, but systems capable of enduring rarely rely solely on brutality. They rely on integration. Integration is quieter, it is less cinematic, it is more durable. The pyramids stand because Egypt, for a time, aligned environment, belief and administration into a coherent structure. When those alignments weakened, monumental building diminished. The monuments were not sustained by endless chains, they were sustained by alignment, and alignment is harder to maintain than force. The myth of slave-built pyramids persists because it fits a familiar template. Power equals oppression equals monument. But the archaeological record tells a more complex story. Power can mobilize without constant violence. It can extract while redistributing. It can compel while offering participation in something larger. This is not romanticization. It is structural reality. People did not build the pyramids because they were free. They built them because they were integrated into a system that made participation rational, meaningful, and seasonally feasible. That distinction matters. It reveals that enduring power is rarely sustained by fear alone. Fear burns brightly and briefly. Systems endure when belief, administration, and material conditions align. The pyramids are not monuments to slave suffering. They are monuments to state capacity. And state capacity, when aligned with belief, can move mountains, or at least stack them. The past is quiet, but it's never done speaking. Subscribe to the history of the world, because understanding how it worked is the first step to understanding where we are now.